Tune in as we tackle the topic of autistic vulnerability, focusing on the challenges of social communication and how they can lead to bullying, harassment, social isolation, and even job loss. We'll discuss practical strategies for parents to support their children and safeguard their well being. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hey, Embracers!
Welcome back.
We have a more vulnerable topic today.
All right. Well, let's do it.
Vulnerability is something that I think is a little bit unspoken when it comes to autism and other disabilities, particularly invisible disabilities, because the consequence of having an invisible disability tends to be that there's essentially a understanding. How do I explain this? It essentially, the consequence tends to be that the individual struggles with silent or invisible consequences of outside action or interference. So that can be bullying, that can be workplace harassment, that can be confusion in social situations. There's a lot of these nuanced conversations or interactions that happen with the world and society that end up impacting autistic individuals that oftentimes society is not aware of. But even so, individuals on the spectrum themselves sometimes do not recognize that this is happening to them for many reasons. A lot of that is that struggle that many autistics have where it comes with the inability to really understand your own emotions or what you're feeling and being able to put a word to that. For example, not being able to understand that the feelings that you're feeling in your body mean anxiety, or not really being able to understand that you're stressed or overwhelmed, or perhaps that you're fearful in a situation that might be dangerous. So that adds a layer of vulnerability to autistics that not every neurotypical or even neurodivergent person struggles with.
Now, would you say one of the, I don't want to say tactics, but one of the uses of like masking is a way to try and combat like vulnerability? Like, is that like a way to kind of keep like almost like society like at a distance because like they're trying to like mask some of their struggles, the sensory components, so that they appear to kind of be more in line with like their peers, essentially? Or is that not necessarily the case, in your opinion?
So I think that like everybody kind of does that in a sense. So whether you're autistic or neurotypical, we as humans tend to adjust our behavior in order to gain approval of society or our culture or our peers. But I do think that one of the struggles that autistic people deal with is kind of a mix of those. So there are some autistics that are able to do that, and that is where you get into that like masking territory. But there's also autistic individuals that don't really perceive that layer of the world. And so they're the ones that, like me, tend to be really blunt and not really understanding that we're offending society or culture with what we're saying, or we might be perceived as rude because we don't really see that extra layer that everybody else sees. So it can really vary on the type of autistic person. It's very independently based, but there's different challenges and different struggles that come with each of those different layers. So for this episode, we basically want to discuss autistic vulnerability, specifically focusing on social communication challenges and their impact. And then we'll share some real life examples that we've seen with some tips on how to support your child through all of that.
I think it's funny that when you mentioned as far as like neurotypicals, as far as like masking as well. And the only thing that came to mind is like when you constantly say like, oh, like when like guys or me like hang out with like a group of like other guys or whatever, like everyone's IQ suddenly starts to drop because you suddenly think things
Yeah.
are a lot more funny than they really should be, or you're doing sometimes dumb or dangerous things that you wouldn't ordinarily do if you were on your own or with like your wife or something. So it's kind of funny that you kind of like mentioned like, oh, you kind of like mask for your peer group. And it's like, yeah, that is essentially true. Like depending on the group that you are with, you kind of take on essentially like a new personality of sorts, like kind of like a new persona, like, oh, this is
Yeah.
like me hanging out with the guys, like, I don't know,
Yeah. Yeah,
character.
and that is due to social cues, right? So when you are hanging out with a group of other people, there's social cues and there's context to that social situation that keys you into how you should be behaving or reacting in that certain situation. However, this is something that autistic individuals often struggle with. I personally struggled with this a lot growing up. And it's basically an inability or a challenge with being able to interpret these cues. So that might be something like sarcasm. If some peer group is implementing a lot of jokes or sarcasm or something like that, we might not cue ourselves into that and we might take sarcasm literally, which can lead to a misunderstanding. Or it can be the reverse of that. It can be that somebody is actually being very serious and we perceive it as sarcasm. And that's something that can also obviously lead to very challenging situations. And this is something that we've definitely noticed with our oldest child.
Right, and I mean, I would say both, you and our oldest child, because certain things are taken very, like, literally occasionally. So, like, but sometimes, like, it makes, like, fantastic jokes that, like, I didn't even think of.
Unintentionally.
Right, but it's kind of like you'll, like, say something, and I'll be like, "Oh, that's funny," like, I wouldn't have perceived it like that because like, the just commonality of the use of the word or whatever. But when you think of it in a different context, it completely flips what you were actually trying to say. So, I mean, if you are trying to, like, navigate the literal meaning of a phrase or word versus like the figurative one constantly through like conversations, that'd be extremely difficult because you have to weigh, okay, are they being literal or like where are they kind of falling in this conversation? And then you're kind of getting kind of like put further behind in the conversation because you're trying to play catch up constantly trying to figure out their true meaning of the conversation. So I can see how that could be, I mean, extremely both exhausting and like challenging at the same time to try and manage both along the course of the conversation.
And the reason that this leaves your child vulnerable, or autistic adults even quite vulnerable in social situations, is because it can result in bullying, social isolation, or even harassment. And that tends to occur for multiple reasons. One of them is, for example, with bullying, autistic children can be targeted because they don't understand social norms. So it's possible that there is some sort of situation happening in the classroom and they see a bunch of kids laughing and then they think, oh, I'm supposed to laugh. But they don't understand that perhaps those were kids that were bullying someone. And then they unintentionally become a bully, thinking that they were doing the right thing. Or it could be the opposite situation where they're the ones being laughed at and they can either join in, which is what our oldest daughter might end up doing. She might think, oh, they're not laughing at me, they're laughing with me, and not understand that she's being bullied. Or it can be the opposite, where they basically are telling them a joke, trying to invite them into the joke, and perhaps even being friendly, but they perceive that as, you're laughing at me. Why are you making fun of me? And they don't understand that they're not. They're just trying to invite them into the social group. And then they miss out in that situation. So, because of that, it leaves your child really vulnerable to social influence.
And unfortunately, we've seen that both sides of that essentially with our oldest, where like a group of kids will like be like breaking the rules at like a playground and they'll be like laughing. So she thinks it's something funny to do. So she'll want to kind of like follow after them as far as like breaking the rules. And then we kind of have to kind of step in and be like, no, this is not like a good group of kids to like play with. They're clearly not like playing by the rules and they're breaking the rules, like don't play with them. So like we kind of have to like step in and like kind of almost like moderate and kind of like pull her out of some of those situations because otherwise she would kind of just go along with it thinking that there's having a great fun time at the playground, not realizing like that is not the right type of group to be socializing with. But then on the other side, if you or I are like or asking her to do something fun, and she perceives it in like a negative way, like we're telling her to do something, she'll kind of get fixated on the, oh, you're bossing me around, you're being rude, versus us trying to like invite her for like a surprise or like something that we're planning on doing that was fun. So she'll get more fixated on like the, oh no, you're telling me to go to the car and I don't want to go to the car because like obviously we're going to go to like, I don't know, McDonald's or something. So we kind of see it on both sides depending on what the circumstances are. But it is very difficult to try and realize, like, how do you navigate those conversations? Um, I mean, because we have a challenging time with her, but how would we teach her how to navigate those conversations when we or another adult is not there to kind of assist her along the path? So she's able to find the social cues to kind of see, is this the right situation? Is this person bossing me around? Are they being friendly? Are they breaking rules? Like trying to figure out like when someone is being genuinely good or trying to manipulate or be bad or try and be a bad influence on her.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have learned because as an adult, I can kind of project our kids into the future a little bit in terms of what my experience has been. But what I've realized is that some of that really does not go away even in adulthood. I have experience, for example, in work life. That oftentimes I will struggle to kind of read the room in certain situations. Luckily, most of the time, this is in casual situations, but oftentimes there'll be like jokes or something like that are taking place in the office, and like that there's always the rules of like office is professional, but then people will be making jokes, so then you're like, okay, so this must mean that we can make jokes in this scenario. And so reading the room and being able to understand like, okay, when is the appropriate time to be able to be allowed to quote unquote break that rule and make jokes versus when do you have to be professional versus what jokes are you allowed to make and what jokes are you not allowed to make, and trying to figure out when they land, when they don't land. That's been something that has been difficult for me to read as an adult, is trying to figure out when is it appropriate to be silly at work and when is it not appropriate to be silly at work. And I never want to be the person who breaks that ice. I always wait for somebody else to break that ice to kind of give me that cue. But even then, I mess it up. So some of this stuff tends to be lifelong, and your kid is going to struggle and just have to keep working through trial and error of trying to understand these situations. And unfortunately, some of the consequences to that tend to be that employers, schools, society may or may not be empathetic to that trial and error troubleshooting process. So that's one of those areas of vulnerability that I've experienced as well. And what I see with our kids is that even though we might understand and be aware of some of these vulnerability points, society might not, and they might misinterpret it. So they might say that you're being rude, you're being impulsive, you're not following directions. One of the things that I struggled with, for example, in work is being able to understand exactly what was being asked of me in a workplace setting, because I had difficulty reading between the lines or being able to read the hidden meaning behind things. And because of that, it resulted not just in like difficulty in completing the task that was requested of me simply because I did not understand the request, but even in social communication situations. Like if I'm sitting and we're all going to have a work lunch and we're all just chit-chatting about the weather or whatever it may be, I can sometimes miss the hidden meaning within that context. And we might be talking about weather, but actually they're making a political conversation. And maybe I didn't realize that it was a political conversation. I thought it was about the weather. And I might have inadvertently made a political comment that I didn't mean to because I thought I was talking about weather. So like things like that can add kind of like unnecessary tension in social situations.
So you're kind of like, "Oh, no, wait, I didn't know there was a hurricane that was, like, coming and gonna crash into us."
Yeah, it's
Uh,
like they'll name the hurricane after
right,
like a politician or something, and I
right.
thought they were talking about a hurricane.
But you do raise an interesting point, and I think a lot of it has been in our society almost pushed into almost like a comedy mentality, if that makes sense. So, like, I think of like when as you're talking about like the challenges in like the workplace, I immediately thought of the TV show The Office, where it's pushed as like a comedy. But if you actually look at the relationship between the coworkers, you see the very different personalities between Dwight and like Jim and some of the other characters. So, like, Dwight is very much following the rules, not trying to break or go outside the rules for the most part. Like, he does obviously pranks, but then you have Jim where he doesn't really care so much about the rules as long as he's able to prank Dwight throughout the series. But you definitely have that separation between a person who's coming to work for the purpose of work and not trying to break out of the social norms. They just want to do their job and kind of get out, versus
Yeah.
the person who is treating it more like a an addition to like a social life. So they socialize, they have friends at work, they build these relationships, they have a lot of gossip and inside jokes and all this. So it really shows like the two different drastic changes between the different personalities that you would potentially run into in a workplace depending on your workplace situation. But obviously it's pushed more as like a comedy, but if you look at it in the context where this isn't necessarily like funny, like there's clearly like I would say like in some cases like mental challenges between like the different coworkers, then it's more of like a more serious like, oh, that's really like unfortunate, like they're not able to read the cues among like the other like staff members.
I actually think that's a really good example because I feel like Dwight is kind of coded autistic in the series. And if you notice, we are watching this with the lens of comedy, but if what was happening in the show was happening in real life, Dwight would be extremely stressed out. Like, Dwight misses out on promotion opportunities because he misinterprets things or he takes things too literally. For example, rule following. This is very common with autistic individuals as we tend to be hardcore black and white rule followers, and Dwight takes that to the extreme. He thinks, hey, this is the rules, we have to do this literally. And then what happens because of that, what happens is the peers in his workplace kind of resent him for it because they want to have fun and relax, or they understand that, yeah, even though we're putting in an 8-hour workday, we're allowed to have like a workplace party or something like that. And his lack of understanding of that puts him in a situation where he's kind of pitted against everyone else because everyone else sees him as like the party pooper, basically. So that is part of what that struggle is with autistic vulnerability, is that because you naturally are more inclined to be the rule follower, to understand things literally, to want to have that routine, to not really understand the social nuances between what is a hard set rule versus what's flexible, it can result in you having these kind of like social clashes with peers who do understand that and want to do that. So that is something that I definitely experienced growing up, particularly when it came to like playing board games or card games or anything like that. I was very much so a rule abider, and I got so frustrated if anybody broke any of the rules, because to me, I was like, you're cheating. You're cheating, and when you cheat, it's not fun. But everyone else was not taking it so seriously. So it was almost like I ruined the fun for them. And when that happens, there's definitely like a social clash because neither side is really enjoying hanging out with the other side. So that kind of rolls into all the social isolation stuff.
Right, and then it becomes difficult because then either you kind of flock to other people who are very much like rule followers like yourself and don't challenge like the social norms essentially, like they kind of fall into place, or you're completely isolated kind of by yourself, which is, I mean, neither of those is, I mean, a like I'd assume like a fun experience because you kind of feel like you're almost like pushed out of society that you're automatically included in because of your job, like you're forced to be involved there, but then you're kind of like pushed to the outskirts a little bit.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what can happen is that people misperceive autistic behavior as like rude, mean, blunt, or much harsher words that I've been called. And that I feel like really stinks because it's kind of a no-win situation, because the autistic individual is in a heightened anxiety situation. So if your child is being really rigid about certain things, oftentimes that comes with a heightened sense of anxiety, and like what we're experiencing on the inside is stress. It's a stress response. We're freaking out because our world is not aligning in the way that our rule book says it should align, and we are basically given a autistic rule book mentally where we're like, okay, if X happens, then you do Y in order to get Z. But if the formula that you're working with doesn't have the letter X, Y, or Z, and you're working with A, B, and C, you kind of fritz out and you're like, what do I do in this situation? And that's why all this anxiety and panic happens. And that's why a lot of autistic individuals are like, no, I need to have these guidelines, because you don't know how to function under those different rules. You haven't been given that handbook. So I feel like that's one of the things that people kind of misinterpret when it comes to autistic kids and adults, is when we are struggling or stressing out or showing a lot of anxiety under those situations, it's really a moment of vulnerability. We really are just open in that moment and not really knowing what to do, where to go, and we kind of panic, and people perceive that negatively. Like they think it's something we're doing intentionally or something we're doing just to be kind of like a nuisance when we're really not.
And with our some of our kids, we've run into the problem of their school will be saying like, "Oh, they're being rude, they're being disrespectful," and this. And so what we have to do is try and ask for as much context as possible to try and figure out like, was it her actually being rude, or was there something else at play where she was just being honest or very straightforward and didn't sugarcoat what was being said. I mean, there are definitely times where she would be like essentially like talking back to like a teacher, and obviously we don't approve of any of that. But then there's also times where she will either misunderstand something that the teacher has said, or she will think that something the teacher said was like incorrect or something that she wanted to kind of voice like her opinion. So it's kind of hard to kind of find like that middle line of like, okay, where does kind of the rudeness come in, and then where does her rigidity with autism kind of play. And obviously, because we're not in the school day all days, we can't really observe any of this. It's all coming to us through either what our daughter is saying or what the teacher is saying. And we're trying to piece together, okay, what was the situation that actually took place and what could have been a characteristic that was acting upon this situation that would have caused her to say that. So that's been kind of our struggle through the years since she's been in school. And I'm not really sure it'll get easier. She might understand more social cues kind of along the way, but I think there'll be more complex situations moving forward that will have to be kind of dissected as we move forward in later years.
Yeah. And there are some things that you can do to tackle some of these things. So, like using social stories to help teach some of the social cues has been helpful for us. Role playing interactions, like making small talk or how to respond appropriately to teasing, has been helpful. Again, you have to really explain what is teasing, what is not teasing, because they will take everything quite literally. And also helping build confidence. So, doing like growth mindset activities like journaling and things like that. Those are things that we've been working on to help our kids recognize these things. But as I said, as an adult who is still struggling with some of these things, I feel like some of it is just like lifelong and it's going to be a struggle regardless. So that's where I think advocacy really comes in place. Unfortunately, in careers and the workplace, discrimination is still a major barrier. Like autistic individuals are still facing challenges when it comes to like hiring practices and lack of accommodations. One particular story that I can mention really briefly is I was doing a job interview, and kid you not, the second round, I blew through the first round with the resumes, but the second round was literally an AI video. And it was a video interview with a robot, and the AI was tracking my eye contact, it was tracking my posture, it was tracking the tone of my voice. And of course, as an autistic person, I bombed out of that because all of those things are discriminatory towards neurodivergent and autistic individuals. So there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to discrimination and hiring practices. But because of that, these social cues still come into play when it comes to workplace barriers. And I don't know if maybe eventually it'll get into school barriers, but at least right now, that is definitely something that is on the rise with AI and something I'm concerned about. But there's also a general lack of understanding of autism, which can lead to ineffective advocacy both in schools and other settings.
And I feel like you also run the risk of like, obviously, like when you're going through the application process, you can disclose this information, but then you kind of run the risk like, would that hurt your chances of getting the job? Like, obviously, they can't discriminate for that purpose, but they can,
Officially.
right? They can't obviously like say like, oh, we're not going to hire them because they have a disability, but like you never actually know like under the table, are they actually not picking you because of that disability? And as long as they don't like voice like that is the reason that they're not hiring you, how would you ever know that that is the reason why like you might get passed up on a job opportunity?
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, it's a real difficult situation because it's like either you almost deny that there is any type of disability to try and get the job, but then you run the risk of if you do get the job, are you able to understand all the social intricate workings along the way with staff and what is being asked of you, or do you disclose and then just see if you're able to get the job and get whatever your, accommodations you need to kind of if you're selected for that job moving forward. So it is kind of like almost flipping a coin, like, what would you rather risk? Would you rather risk, like, disclosing up front, or not necessarily saying anything until you get the job and then trying to get documentation through HR? And that's kind of the, I don't know, the guesswork of which is the best course of action.
And honestly, like, I will say from my experience, because I have gone through so many negative experiences in the workplace with various jobs when it comes to autistic discrimination. My best advice from my personal experience is do not disclose, especially in the interview process, because yes, legally they're not allowed to discriminate, but I am telling you they discriminate. And there's no way to catch them because as long as they don't discriminate on paper and it's all like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, they can get away with it. So I personally feel like it's always best to avoid disclosing, at least in the interview process. And then if you need accommodations, then apply for those after you are out of that like 90-day hiring window. But even so, I've been in situations where as soon as I put in the accommodation request, that's when they let you go. So there are definitely lots of discriminatory companies out there still. So I would not recommend disclosing unless you absolutely have to, or if you feel that the company actually does believe in those values and principles. Um, but that's part of those like systemic challenges that autistic individuals are still facing. There's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that can delay those supports that you need, like the accommodations. And then there's also those social communication difficulties that make self advocacy really challenging for autistic individuals. Because on top of all the barriers of like once you've been able to communicate the need for those supports, a lot of autistic individuals struggle to even communicate those. So, like our youngest, for example, she has lots of needs. Maybe she needs earmuffs, for example, because her hearing is really sensitive. She has a really hard time self advocating for those. So, even if she has earmuffs available to her, even if somebody has told her she can have access to them, in that moment of heightened anxiety, she always goes to covering her ears and curling into a ball. She kind of gets into fetal position and she does not self advocate. And I know for me, one of the things that my mom has noticed with me growing up is that even to this day, I tend to not recognize when I need help. And I just stay in a heightened sense of anxiety and stress without realizing that I can ask for certain supports, accommodations, or help. And I just stay in that stress essentially without requesting those accommodations. So I even struggle to self advocate, ironically, because I'm great at advocating for my kids, not so much at recognizing when I have my own needs. So that's something that will always, I think, be a struggle for certain autistic individuals.
So maybe we should work on you advocating your needs, and we can do the same thing that we do for the kids just for you, and then you guys can all be on the same, like, group, like the same page, the
Yeah.
same group together.
So, because of all of this that we've talked about and autistic vulnerability in general, it's really important that we be proactive in building our kids' self esteem and working on that piece of it. Because if we focus on our kids' strengths and their achievements, like maybe their artistic talent, our older child is really artistic, then we can help them create these like safe social environments. We can put them in areas that they would flourish in. And that's something like art club for our kid, for example. Put them in something that we know they thrive in and they get enjoyment in, and they would make connections with other peers who get it and also have similar interests. So that's something that we are looking forward to doing with our kids, and something that helped me growing up is finding those niche, quote unquote, geek groups that had the same nerdy interest that I had, and I always felt at home within those little sectors.
But I think that that's also smart too, because you have a group of people who may be kind of pushed aside by like some of the other groups, like as far as like the jocks or like the cheerleaders or some of the other groups that are sometimes a little bit more mean and judgmental than others. And then they get into like a group where they're all about like playing video games or doing like cosplay or playing board games or something. But then they're more, I feel like, generally more accepting of like who you are as a person, and they understand like, oh, okay, I've had struggles too because I've kind of been pushed out from whatever group I had come in. So I feel like that's kind of like the safety net um, where our kids can hopefully find like a group that is a little bit more meaningful to them that they can connect with versus like trying to be bullied by some other group and not understanding that they're being bullied or um, being picked on or whatever the reason might be.
Yeah. So basically, overall, understanding and addressing social communication to support your kid is really crucial. So, finding practical strategies to help them through these social interactions and helping them build confidence is a good preemptive way to tackle this head on. And also remember that you, as parents, are not alone. You can reach out for support and resources in your local community or through our podcast or through our community membership. But also remember to remind your child that they are not alone. If they are feeling particularly vulnerable, it's our job as their parents to be that rock and try to help connect them to A, their emotions, but B, the support and resources that they might need to help them thrive, such as putting them in one of these like groups or clubs that they might do better in. So that's definitely what we are keeping an eye on when it comes to our girls, and something I would recommend for parents out there as well.
Yep, I think that's the best approach. I mean, and honestly, like keep working with them. And if you see like a situation in like a like TV show, try and bring it up and try and say like, oh, how do you think this character feels? Because I feel like if you're able to pull them into a situation where they're able to see how another character might be feeling when they're treated, if they're being picked on or teased or something, then they can try and apply that to their own life and situations that they might encounter in the future.
Yeah. So I want to ask you guys what you think. Have you witnessed autistic vulnerability in your child? Or if you're autistic, have you experienced it yourself? Which area do you feel that your child or you experience the most vulnerability in? And what do you wish people would understand about autistic vulnerability? Let us know in the comments below if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook at Autism Wish, or if you're listening on the podcast, feel free to join the Embracing Autism community. Become a member today at autismwish.org, and you can leave comments there. We can continue the conversation there and answer any questions that you might have. Thanks for hanging out, and we will see y'all next time.
Bye.
Bye.